Today at the National Press Club, Jeff Dimery, Alinta Energy's CEO and Managing Director. A senior figure in the energy sector, he'll talk about Australia's energy transition and calls for a blended mix to be considered as part of that plan. Jeff Dimery with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia on Ngunnawal country for today's Westpac address. I'm Jane Norman, an ABC reporter and a director here at the club. Our guest today is Jeff Dimery, Chief Executive of energy giant Alinta. Australia is in the midst of a complex and challenging clean energy transition, overhauling a fossil fuel-dominated electricity grid to one powered predominantly by renewables. It's been likened to a modern-day industrial revolution, and Alinta has a foot in both old and the new. It owns coal and gas-fired power stations, and it's investing in large-scale wind farms and batteries. Few would question the need or the urgency to decarbonise, but the speed and scale of this transition is causing concern in some quarters, particularly in regional Australia. You can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust. Our hashtag is NPC. Please welcome Jeff Dimery.
Thank you, Jane. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the National Press Club for hosting today's address. It's an absolute honour. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. I grew up on Evans Street in Port Melbourne, Victoria. My late mum, Wilma, and my 5 siblings and I lived in a workers' cottage. And then we moved into a small housing commission flat a few doors down the street. My mum, who raised us from when I was 3 on her own, worked in a pub on the same street. I went to visit Evans Street last year. The pub was still there, although it's changed its name and it's had a pretty substantial refurbishment since the last time I peeked in. I couldn't help but reminisce about my first job selling newspapers outside the pub, my first taste of entrepreneurialism. I did deals and upsold newspapers with jars of pickled mussels to the patrons that I'd scraped off the pier at Port Melbourne earlier that day. I have great memories of my childhood. My mum, with the help from our neighbours and the help of us kids, did an amazing job of ensuring we never went without. But we lived in housing commission for a reason. We were a tight-knit and loving family. We just didn't have much money. I'm not sharing my story to elicit sympathy. I've obviously been fortunate with my life and career, and my childhood situation is not my situation today. I'm sharing my story because I genuinely understand what it's like for families struggling to make ends meet. And I'm sharing it because I know, of course, that many Australians today are finding it tough. Our cost of living challenges are real, and it's been a difficult few years. I mention this at the outset because the task ahead of us, the energy transition, the most important economic and engineering change in our lifestyles, one that's moving us away from an energy and industrial system based on fossil fuels to one built on renewables, is challenging. And if we don't get this right, then it won't just be people who share my childhood experience that feel the pinch. We're all here in this room today because of the Australians we serve and work with in one way or another. Whether they're constituents and communities, customers, or industry partners. At Alinta Energy, our focus is on working safely with each other to run the most efficient business we can, to put downward pressure on the price consumers pay, and to keep the lights on and to keep industry competitive. People need and rightly demand that focus. And recent Redbridge polling confirms that the highest energy priority for almost 2/3 of Australian voters is lower cost. Today, I want to do three things. I want to respond to the myths and misconceptions about the industry and talk about the important role that pricing has to play in enabling our critical energy transition. I also want to explain what's caused the drop in investment for large-scale renewables and the role households can play in the transition from this point forward. And I want to leave you with a view that how we successfully work together, industry, governments and consumers, and blend different energy sources efficiently will be what sees Australia on the right track to manage and succeed in the transition. I promise I'll do my best not to bombard you with stats, but I did study economics and finance, so expect there to be a few. I want to start by saying clearly, I support the energy transition 100%. I support the lowest cost, most economically efficient transition. We know Australians want it, and we do too. But I'm standing here today because I don't think we're having clear conversations and public debate about all aspects of that transition. Despite some recent great strides and clear direction from government, unfortunately, the transition is getting harder, not easier. The era of easy wins is over. The hard wins lay ahead. In January, AEMO released a draft of its 2024 Integrated System Plan, in which it outlined the significant task that utility-scale wind and solar has ahead of it to replace coal-fired capacity and provide for tomorrow's industry and transport. By 2035, the NEM is forecast to need 82 gigawatts of utility-scale solar and wind. That's 4 times the current capacity. By 2050, we need to hit 126 gigawatts. That means that we need to develop more than 7 times the current NEM capacity of 19 gigawatts to phase out coal by 2050. That's close to a doubling every decade. We don't have time to get distracted by fringe voices anymore, or to get lost in the gunners, as in there's going to be 20,000 jobs or there's going to be some new technology that comes to the rescue. We have to work with what we know today. The task is vast, and the large energy players in Australia today are crucial to our success. And it's organisations like Alinta Energy that have the skills and track record to make an impact. So how's the industry shaping up to get the job done? Well, the hard truth is that it's not the greatest time to be an energy retailer. Here's the big reveal. We don't actually make amazing returns. There's a powerful misconception out there that because energy prices have increased, we therefore make super profits. That isn't the reality. According to the ACCC's recent pricing report, retail margins are down to their lowest levels. The average household electricity bill is $1,500. The average annual retail margin for electricity is $34. That retail margin accounts for about 2% of that average $1,500 bill. The biggest costs are network fees and charges, which represent around 45% of your total bill. Then wholesale electricity at 33%, followed by retail and other costs and environmental costs, both at 10%. That 2% average retail margin per residential customer, the $34 per year, That's a little bit less than a family meal at my local Red Rooster. If we have a peek over the fence at industry superannuation sector, let's compare the pair, as they like to say. The average industry super fees for a 45 to 50-year-old with an average $250,000 balance is about 90 times more at $3,100 per year. Now, I'm not picking on the super sector. I want my super to do well and to deliver healthy returns just like everybody else. But super is almost universal, and energy costs are almost universal, hence the comparison. So the margins are modest. But has the energy sector delivered great returns in Australia over the last 5 years? There's an easy answer, and it's no. Any profits made on generating and trading wholesale energy on average across recent years have generally been in the single digits. In the last 5 years, the top 3 gentailers in this country have collectively written off in excess of $10 billion of shareholder funds. There's a race to net zero, but it's supposed to be for emissions, not for profit. In the early era of renewables, Australia had the perfect investment climate for wind, solar and pumped hydro. It could have been seen as the gold rush for renewable generation, and certainly we saw no shortage of companies trying to get a piece of the action. But very quickly, projects started to fail, loss factors increased, and investment cases started to crumble. With a lack of planning and proper infrastructure, we quickly found the grid overwhelmed, leading to instances of curtailment and a lack of profitability, like the aptly named rhombus of regret. I've had the benefit of working on every part of the energy supply chain for approximately 30 years. I was a pioneer of the early large-scale investments and the formation of the industry bodies and policies that supported their entry. You can look at my track record and Alinta Energy's track record. I'm happy to be judged on our performance. 98.5% commercial availability over the past 3 years for our brown coal-fired power station in the Latrobe Valley. That's no clunker. The first grid-forming battery in Australia. What was at the time Australia's largest remote solar farm, and the development and continued operation of a wind farm that produces more renewable energy than any other in Western Australia. The list goes on. Allow me to use this forum today as an opportunity to be clear about what is needed to make more progress. The energy transition cannot be achieved by simply having small entrants building new, shiny, low capex, quickly built projects that throw extra generation into the grid. The energy transition requires a group of energy participants capable of leaning into the bigger issues, to build portfolios that provide generation and firming, that give power back to consumers to invest directly into this transition, to fund and enable community batteries, selling back to grid, peer-to-peer energy trading, empowering the prosumer. Indeed, AEMO notes that the plan for true transformation of the national electricity market from fossil fuels to firmed renewables, quote, calls for levels of investment in generation, storage, transmission and system services that exceed all previous efforts combined, end quote. So why has there been a halt in the progress we require? What's stopping more private investment in renewables? I've mentioned that retail margins are relatively low and that the industry has written off $10 billion over the last 5 years. If it's not an industry flush with profits, then how can it invest in new generation? Not on the scale required for transition in any event. And despite the profits reported in the last financial year, the investment outlook for large-scale renewables is challenging. Let me tell you why. Higher cost and uncertainty about recovering those costs. That's why. In 2017, Alinta Energy developed and built the first big battery in Australia for around $1.5 million per megawatt. Right now, we're building another one that will cost roughly $1.7 million per megawatt. That's up. In 2020, it cost around $850,000 to insure a gas-fired power plant. Today, it's around $1.175 million. That's up 40%. I shocked people when I spoke at a conference 2 years ago and said that it would cost $8 billion to hypothetically replace our brown coal-fired power station, which was acquired for $1.1 billion. Replacing it with pumped hydro and offshore wind today would now cost in excess of $10 billion, up $2 billion in a mere 2 years. Developers, rightly, are afraid to lock in high costs in case they can't be recovered. When I sat down to write this speech, the future Victorian energy price for the 2026 calendar year was $58 a megawatt hour. In 2026, we'll still have plenty of brown coal in the system, producing round-the-clock baseload energy, topped up by a decent amount of large-scale renewables and rooftop PV. That's great. But at $58, I can't build anything to meaningfully prepare for coal to come out of the system. I can't build more solar because we already have a solar glut in the middle of the day, which is sending spot prices deeply negative. If I was just looking at that forward price, I would also be very wary about building new wind because the margin would be so slim to non-existent, and any curtailment, which is a growing problem, could be disastrous. And I certainly couldn't reach financial close on pumped hydro without a clear price signal or support, which in our view will be critical technology in our future blended energy mix. Australians got a sense of how bumpy the transition might become when Ukraine was invaded, and the government stepped in to shield them and businesses with caps on coal and gas pricing. Intervention may be at times necessary, but it can also be difficult to undo. One intervention can quickly lead to another. It's a bit like trying to make one of those stress balls filled with liquid smaller by giving it a bit of a squeeze. You can't, it just expands between your fingers. Governments are acting in a way that shows that they appreciate the dynamic and the challenges at hand. Funding by the Capacity Investment Scheme and state government contributions is becoming essential for large-scale renewables. The Rewiring the Nation commitments and supporting the transmission required so that new renewable projects can connect to the grid. But there are gaps and risks. Our goals can't be achieved without the deployment of new private capital. State and Commonwealth balance sheets simply cannot carry the financial burden. We have a glut of daytime rooftop solar energy. At the same time, at 95% of all large-scale renewables are getting curtailed, basically switched off, in some hours of high rooftop solar days. The percentage of all energy produced by large-scale renewables that was curtailed increased from 10% in the last quarter of 2022 to 13% in the last quarter of 2023. Now you might think, 3%, who cares? Well, boards care, investors care, and developers care. No one wants to lose 13% of their output, and no one dares think just how much more could be lost. That could be the difference between profitable and unprofitable. In short, ladies and gentlemen, continued subsidies at one end of the market are driving higher uptake into a glut and undermining the economics of new and existing large-scale renewables. It means we need to focus on delivering a blend of energy reliably and affordably. Now, don't get me wrong, I know how much households love their solar and how important solar is to the transition. But as with any of the intermittent technologies, on its own, it has pluses and minuses we need to solve for. The daytime production from rooftop solar needs to be stored and shifted to when it's required. We'll need household batteries, but they'll fill up quickly. We'll need big batteries. They'll also fill up quickly too. EVs will take time to build up to critical mass, and for vehicle to home and vehicle to grid models and standards to flourish. The keys, which have been pointed out by others, but bear repeating, are long duration storage, high capacity renewables like offshore wind, gas to fill the gaps, and empowering and being honest with customers. Long duration storage, particularly projects like Snowy 2.0 in New South Wales and Kidston in Queensland, that can be dispatched quickly, are urgently needed to help deal with the daytime solar glut. Without pumped hydro, or in Victoria's case, if the generation profile isn't uplifted by offshore wind to something closer to baseload, then coal and rooftop solar will be locked in a negative feedback loop. This will undermine emissions reductions, and it will undermine the economics of new large-scale renewables and storage developments. Even if pumped hydro and offshore wind are more expensive upfront, how will it compare to leaving the grid issues unchecked? These are the urgent conversations we need to have. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the big drivers for me personally and for Alinta Energy is making this transition as equitable for customers as possible. And there are opportunities available to industry to help customers through technology. For example, Alinta Energy is scoping the ability of customers with rooftop solar and batteries to transfer or trade a portion of their output to family members. We know it's technically possible on our platform, and it should help to alleviate some of the imbalances of homeowners dominating solar and battery installations. We're exploring other options too, like inviting retail customers to be co-investors in wind farms and giving them a portion of the output offset against their bill, as well as providing better insights about their appliances via itemised bills that show what's being spent on heating and cooling and refrigeration, and even suggesting replacements that would be funded by energy savings. We're also doing our best to operate efficiently, to keep costs low, and to leverage scale and technology to make our impact count. From an asset development perspective, with limited labour available, large engineering, procurement and construction contractors don't get excited about the prospect of installing one big battery, but we can get their attention by talking about a $10 billion pipeline. You came here for truths and straight talking about the transition, so here's a doozy. Australians will have to pay more for energy in the future. We will spend more as a percentage of GDP on energy, energy services and energy infrastructure. Whether we pay through the tax base or pay the large upfront cost of an EV or batteries and solar, or we're paying more for electricity from the grid, we'll all pay more in aggregate. We need to be honest about that. And I don't think the average Australian is prepared for that reality. Capital costs more. Labour costs more. Transmission costs are rising. But there are going to be alternatives. Electricity might cost more, but your petrol bill might disappear. And if we're prepared to change behaviour and you use most of our energy within certain windows of time, you'll be able to have greater control of your bill. Getting over the hump of this very difficult part of the transition is going to require partnerships in all directions. Australia has a real opportunity to leverage renewable energy in this country. with proven technologies that we can work to firm up our economic security and resilience. For governments, that means maintaining clear public policy and not getting distracted with new ideas without a firm social mandate. We know what energy mix we need to blend together today. We just need to get on with it. And for industry, we'll partner with customers to help them store and shift their load to when energy is cheap. And hopefully, we'll partner with governments to bring on large duration storage to help shift the glut of solar out of the middle of the day for use during peak times. Alinta Energy is spending tens of millions of dollars on development of a multi-billion-dollar pipeline of renewable projects because we're optimistic that these issues can and will be resolved. Australia has made tremendous progress on the transition so far, and we're optimistic about the industry's ability to deliver more if the settings are right. Ladies and gentlemen, the energy transition is tough and getting tougher, but it is doable. In my view, the greatest challenge will be achieving our shared goal while ensuring efficiently priced and reliable supply is maintained. We need to be optimistic, yes, but also realistic. The industry costs have risen and the current margins and returns are relatively modest. Developers are pulling back on commitments to build large-scale renewables because they don't want to lock in high prices that may not be recouped. Rooftop solar is contributing to low energy prices at various times in daylight hours, but it isn't affected by price signals in the same way large-scale generators are. It's a problem we need to solve. Yes, with gas and with pumped hydro and offshore wind and more batteries, in partnership with household and governments. We're all on the same team, and all we're really debating is the pathway. It can be, it can't be, in fact, an all or nothing game. The risks are too great. So let's be straight up with each other about the transition. Let's do our best to keep costs down and get the blend right and the timing right, and let's get on with it. Thank you.
Jeff, thanks so much for your speech today. Very much some truth bombs and straight talking included there. I just wanted to go to the consumer angle. So you're saying that Australians will have to pay more for energy in the future. So the current average annual household bill, you say, is $1,500 a year. I guess for a lot of people who listen to the energy debate, they're consistently told that cleaner energy will equal cheaper energy. You've gone to some of these points in the speech, but I guess can you just sort of reiterate, if we're using more wind and solar, which is free fuel, why is it that household power bills, you believe, will not be falling anytime soon?
Yeah. So when we talk about wind and solar, we're really focusing in on what I described as 33% of the bill, Jane. So that's the wholesale energy component of the bill. And as everybody is well aware, through the rewiring of the nation, we're going to be spending billions and billions of dollars extending the transmission network to connect new projects. That's currently 45% of the bill. In addition, what you hear in mainstream media is a debate around what is the lowest cost, newest form of generation. And there's no doubt, would agree wholeheartedly with the view that renewable energy is the lowest cost new form of generation. However, the cost of new renewable is still far more expensive than the cost of aged coal equipment. And I gave the example at Loy Yang B, a $1 billion asset being replaced by $10 billion of investment. And if you do investment returns, you'll understand it can't help but be more expensive. Having said that, it's cheaper than replacing coal with coal. So it's a half-truth is what I'm saying. But I think that anybody out there that is relying purely on the grid for their energy will end up paying more. Having said that, I'd also like to acknowledge the work that's been done by both state and federal government in supporting consumers with their energy bills. They too understand the cost of living crunch that I referred to early in my speech, and they've been very proactive in trying to soften the blow for consumers in a rising cost environment.
All right, a question is from Andrew Probyn.
Mr Dimery, Andrew Probyn from 9 News. I just want to go through some of your horror numbers there. As you just mentioned, you reckon it's going to cost about $10 billion to replace Loy Yang B with hydro and offshore wind. But you also noted that AEMO says that we need about 82 gigawatt by 2035 or thereabouts. So that's in a dozen years. So if you do the maths, it's about $850 billion to replace the coal-fired generation. With that $850 billion, which is an enormous amount, how much of that would you expect coming from government subsidy, industry investment, but more importantly, consumers?
It's a difficult question to answer insofar as, let me talk about the capacity investment scheme, for instance. So we now understand that we're going to see a change in market design with the introduction of a capacity investment scheme. The purpose of that scheme is to facilitate more renewable investment. And the way that the design of that scheme will work is that there will be a cap and a floor arrangement with private investors. And to the extent that investments pass through the floor, the government will top that up. And to the extent that those investments are above the cap, then the private sector would contribute that back to government to give, I guess, investable returns basically is the aim. The problem with that is that right at the moment we have a gross pool whereby the price is the clearing and the signal for the market to invest. And if you start to create revenue streams outside of that through a PPA, a cap and collar arrangement, then that will, by definition, start to undermine the economics of that gross pool. And so what we now are aware of is the first part of a market redesign puzzle, and we're yet to understand what the remaining pieces of that puzzle will look like. I say that because I think, depending on the market design, will ultimately determine what percentage of funds are invested by the private sector and how much of those funds need to be underwritten by a government in a less transparent, lower price signal marketplace. But I think what is clear, and I know comments were made recently by, for instance, Greg Combay, as to the magnitude of the investment required, and I don't think anyone's debating that. But in order to attract the sort of investment levels we're talking about, then there will need to be commercial returns to do that, or it will have to be underwritten by the government.
Just for viewers, just cutting through some of those acronyms, do you think, therefore, that a high proportion of that $850 billion over the next 12 years will come from consumers?
Again, it's difficult. I mean, ultimately, yes, it all comes from consumers, whether it's through the bill directly or through the tax base. It has to be consumers that pay for this transition.
Okay.
Thanks for your address, Mr Dimery. It's Mike Foley from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age newspapers. Just a couple of points on the Latrobe Valley, if I may, where you obviously operate Loy Yang B. AEMO expects all Victorian coal to be gone from the grid by 2032, and all coal gone from the national grid by 2038. Just wondering, with Alinta listing the official closure date at 2047, is that your message to workers at that plant that they should expect employment opportunities up until that date, 2047? And further on the community, with the federal opposition now promoting nuclear energy to be co-located or located on the site of retiring coal plants, do you think there'd be community acceptance where you work in the Latrobe Valley for a nuclear reactor?
I'll start by addressing the first question. I note there's a couple of the management team of Loy Yang B in the room today. We're very open and honest in our conversations with our employees. The 2047 date that you rightly point out is the design life for Loy Yang B. The conversation we've had with our employees that we will continue to generate from coal-fired power station as long as the market continues to need that supply. And that will be the market that determines our closure date. And that's consistent with our experience when Alinta closed the Northern Power Station in South Australia. You mentioned a couple of dates there from AEMO, 2032 and 2038. I'm a little more pessimistic, if you want to put it that way, that coal will predominantly be out of the market by 2032. I think that's probably a bit premature when you look at the progress that we're making around the broader transition. The other point I would make is 2038 date for some plant. Loy Yang B is the lowest marginal cost, most reliable coal-fired power station in the country. So I would think purely based on economics, it would be the last plant to close. Your next question was about the public's reaction or acceptance of nuclear in the Latrobe Valley. The short answer is I'm not sure. We haven't polled them. We care very much about our workers and our workforce, and I think that it's incumbent upon us and upon governments to make sure that we have a just transition plan for when we do close. The broader issue of nuclear, it's a question we're getting a bit more lately. My view is that nuclear really is a political question, and it's something that the folks up on the Hill really need to resolve. And what I mean by that is I'm 55 years old. The ability to develop nuclear in this country, it's not legislated, it's not legal at this point. And I would imagine there's a lengthy process to go through to get it to that point. And then there's a lengthy process to go through the development and construction, in which time I'll be retired. So it's probably for the younger folks to debate and opine. But what I would say is that you could imagine our shareholder and our board wouldn't be too impressed if the management team was sitting around contemplating building power stations that are not legal. It wouldn't be a great use of our time.
Sorry, Mike, I was busily scribbling notes and forgot my cue for you, but the next question is from Jacob Grieber.
Sorry about that. Jacob Grieber, Financial Review. So a couple of things jumped out at me. The first is you talked about who are the fringe. You talked about the fringe voices who live in this world of gonna do something, gonna have 20,000 jobs, gonna have technology that'll save us. Something's going to come from somewhere. Who are you talking about there?
Look, it's a broad statement, but I think if you went back over the past decade and added up all of the jobs announcements associated with the development of new energy projects in the Australian marketplace, we'd probably be employing almost every citizen in the country. So I'm a little bit cynical about some of those announcements and what I see play out. So it's not targeted at anybody in particular, but it's just a general observation.
And can I ask you too, you talked a lot about the rising cost of these projects, whether they're for coal, fossil fuels, whether they're renewables. Can you explain why they're getting more expensive? Is this about capital? Is it about labour? Is it about civil construction firms struggling to deliver these projects? What's made it worse in the last sort of 12, 18 months?
So the answer is yes, 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 and there's more. So there's no doubt that the cost of capital is up. We've seen that through interest rate cycles globally. There's no doubt that there are labour shortages. We've got a very tight labour market, and so even the cost to attract talent in this environment is more costly than it's ever been. In addition to that, it's not just the domestic talent pool where we're competing for resource. I mean, we're competing with the US and Europe, and they have big subsidy programs through the IRA in the case of the US that are incentivising the development of these projects, and so the economics are enhanced in that environment. And so companies that we're competing with are in a better position to pay labour to come and complete those projects. So there's an example. We're still suffering, I think, from the tail end of all the supply bottleneck issues that we had coming out of COVID. They have not been resolved, not fully anyway. And so we're suffering from that as well. And the big one, another big one, is social licence, I think, and an ability for a company such as ours to develop new large-scale renewable projects, and the degree of community consultation that is required across various stakeholders has become more difficult and more complex. And so as organisations, again, we respond to that, and I'm not trying to discount the necessity to do that, but we need to be better at it. And so we need to hire people with the right skills and capabilities to forge those relationships and earn the trust of the local community to understand what their concerns are so we can better address them.
Thanks.
Can I just ask you on the social licence issue? In covering regional affairs, I've been to a lot of big agricultural areas around the country, and whether it's New England in New South Wales or whether it's near sort of Ballarat, Bendigo in Victoria, there is such a level of, I suppose, mistrust that has been, risen, I guess, from poor community consultation processes. Like, why has it been handled so poorly by so many companies? I'm not saying every company, but many have. Yeah,
look, it's a valid and fair point that you raised, Jane, and we're always looking at what we do and ways to improve that. I mean, I just highlight, quite a few years back we had an on-land wind farm development in the state of Victoria that Alinta had progressed. We actually walked away from that project. It was commercial, but there was no community support, and we felt that if we went on and developed that project, we wouldn't be accepted by the community, and it would cause enormous brand damage to us as an organisation, and it would undermine our ability to develop in other communities that might be more amenable to our projects. But collectively, I think that you would hear honestly from companies and from governments that we can do much better, we need to do much better, and we're starting to do much better. And if the companies don't take the responsibility to do better themselves, then governments are starting to look at how to legislate the benefits that must be shared with the community, etc., for projects to go ahead. So I would say we're starting to mature, but there's still work to go.
Right. Ben Westcott.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you very much for your speech today. Sorry about that. One of the things we heard about before the last election as being one of the biggest reasons for bottlenecks in renewable investment was a lack of political consensus over the future of Australia's renewable transition. Now, the consensus is slightly more together, but again, we're seeing a lack of bipartisan support across the aisle for what the vision for Australia's energy future looks like. How much is that holding back renewable investment in Australia?
I'm a pretty optimistic guy, so I'll go for the glass half full to start with, anyway. The pleasing thing that I'm hearing coming into the next federal election is that both of the main political parties are committed to net zero by 2050. And I think this whole concept of climate deniers hopefully is now off the table. So really what we're debating is what is the right road map to get to net zero by 2050. And clearly the Liberal National Party are looking at, for instance, the replacement of baseload coal with baseload nuclear. And I've already commented, on how we see that right now from an Alinta perspective. The current government is more focused around the technologies that are there today. But I think, Minister Bowen has a very, very difficult job, as does Daniel Westerman, the head of AEMO. And you'll see the changes in the composition of the energy mix year on year as these ISPs are released. And so the best we can do right now, from my perspective, is keep ploughing on with what we know and what we've got. We're all on the same page that there's an outcome we're shooting for. I guess the big debate is around how quick we get there. What would you pay to be there a day early? And what would you be prepared to save to be there a day late? And I think that's really what we're talking about now. And that's very refreshing from where we were, 4 or 5 years ago, where we weren't even on the same page.
And just one line from your speech I wanted to dwell down on. You said governments shouldn't get distracted by new ideas without a social mandate. What in particular were you referring to there?
So what I was saying was that we have a social mandate to do what we do, and we need to get on with that within that envelope. If at some point that social mandate changes, then of course we need to at that point consider other options. But today, and I gave the analogy that my board and our shareholder wouldn't want a management team sitting around hypothesising about generation that we just can't build.
Thank you.
Just to go back to a question about nuclear, we don't know the full details of the Coalition's policy. We're expecting that to be released shortly, but from reporting, they're suggesting that they'll replace the existing fleet of coal-fired power stations with nuclear as a kind of firming low emissions technology. As a company that owns a coal-fired power station, can nuclear be developed quickly enough to replace the capacity of outgoing coal-fired power stations?
Look, I'm not a nuclear expert, let me say at the outset. Let me talk about our coal-fired power station at Loy Yang B and what we're doing and why we're doing it. We have explored transitioning away from coal to biomass, wood chip. The issue with that is that there's not enough domestic supply, quite frankly, to fulfil our fuel needs, and so we would have to import. And then we have to set up a significant supply chain. And when you look at that, and we've also looked at that in the context of capturing any emissions that are created by burning biomass and using carbon capture and storage, and the economics are less than compelling. So we haven't proceeded on that base, although we haven't struck out the opportunity. We've kind of shelved it to see where we end up in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time from a cost perspective. And I might add, just to be clear, that when you think about biofuel, the early part of that supply chain is that you grow trees and that you abate carbon. When you burn the trees, you emit the carbon, you're back to zero. And then if you're able to capture and store it, then you're net negative when it comes to emissions. So if we're going to get to net zero, then we're going to have some negatives in the economy. And so that's why we were keen to explore that particular technology. From a replacement timeframe point of view, as I pointed out, I'm 55. If you add 10 years, that'll get us to 2034. And there'll still be coal in the market at 2034. AGL's timetable for Loy Yang A is 2035, and even AEMO is saying there'll be coal in 2038. So it's not, again, something that we've turned our mind to, but based on what I've read, could you, if you started now, have nuclear in the market by 2035 or 2038? The answer would be yes. But again, no one's starting now because the legislation isn't conducive to us even exploring that. So again, it's kind of like looking for unicorns in the garden.
Our next question is from Chris Ullman.
Chris Ullman from Screencraft. Mr. Dimery, you're talking about, we go back to the beginning of your speech and you were talking about your own childhood and living in social housing. Is Australia about to see the greatest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich that we have ever seen? Because people like me and like you will be able to get solar power and Tesla batteries, while those who are forced to stay on the grid will be charged ever more for the power that they get.
That is a risk. There's no question that there could end up being the haves and the have-nots, and we talk about I guess, energy equality and providing people with the opportunity. One of the things I talked about in the speech that we're looking at, quite frankly, is giving people who live in high-density housing the opportunity to co-invest in renewable projects, so that instead of getting an energy bill, we'll be able to send them an energy statement which shows the credit on the return that they earn from co-investing, their portion of the energy production offset against the home energy bill. And I would think there's great opportunity. We talked about the magnitude of the capital required to fund this transition, for governments to start to think creatively about how they might incentivise mums and dads to invest directly in renewable projects, whether it be tax concessions and things like that, rather than having them work through those superannuation bodies who take their fees on the way through. Let them invest directly with the energy companies. I'm sure there are other examples, Chris. For instance, the digital technology we've now created, we're very much focused, and again, the questions today, they're all sort of focusing on the back end of the system. And by that, I mean the upstream, the utility scale. One of the areas we've lagged most in this transition is the customer at the customer face. And what I mean by that was I was alluding to your energy bill, and it's here now. So I'm not selling you futures of 2 or 3 years down the track. My last bill from Alinta Energy, I was able to go in and take a look at how much of my energy I spent on refrigeration, how much of my energy I spent on heating, how much I spent on cooling and the like. And I think that starts to empower the consumer when they get access to that information. The analogy I like to use is, and they're very topical, supermarkets at the moment, but imagine you went to your local Coles or Woolies and you got a whole shopping trolley full of groceries, and you arrive at the checkout point and someone looks at your trolley and says, oh, look, that'll be $900, thanks. No scanning, no itemising. How would you feel about that? Well, that's what happens to you every month or every quarter with your energy bill. It just turns up with a lump sum amount. Yes, you'll know some was for network and some was for the retailer, including the generation. But understanding the breakup of that will give you the ability to start to modify behaviour. And to the extent that people are getting left behind, I think that's where government really ought to focus around how and where they supplement energy bills for those in need.
And just one other thing, can I take you through some of the big numbers that you were talking about and that AEMO also talks about? So we've got 20,000 kilometres, I understand, of transmission line at the moment in the national electricity market on the East Coast. We're going to build another 10,000 kilometres. 26 years away we are from completing this task. AEMO says we'll need 42,000 more electricians in the next 7 years just to do that. You talk about 7 times the generation that we have now, all to hit net zero in 2050. In what Australia does that happen? Isn't net zero a target that we are going to go nowhere near hitting by 2050?
Well, if I steal the line of others in the industry and some commentators, this transition has been described as akin to a post-war reconstruction effort. And it's true. When you highlight the magnitude and the numbers you've just talked about, Chris, that's where we find ourselves. So it's a monumental task. And I'm not hearing anybody downplay the magnitude of that. Does that mean we won't get there? I think it's challenging, as I said. Would I stand here today in 2024 looking out to 2050 and tell you something can't be done? No, I wouldn't. But I can tell you that absent some significant changes along the way, we will struggle.
Our next question is from David Denham.
David Denham from Preview magazine. Thank you very much for your very interesting and challenging talk. Just one comment before we go on. I think the nuclear one is as much economic as it is political. But at any rate, I'll leave it with that. The question is, you've mentioned a whole raft of things that we should be doing or could be doing. And we know, as people have said, that it's really urgent now because we've already passed the 1.5 degrees, the water's temperature's gone up, we're going to have more floods, blah, blah, blah. What I'd liked to hear from you is just 3 or 4 focused actions that we should be focusing on, because you've spread it out and it is a complex thing. But what are the few focused things we should be doing to achieve zero emissions?
Number one for me is settling the future market design and being really clear about how that looks so that participants can assess the commercial opportunities that are out there for the reconstruct. Because without those commercial opportunities, it will all fall back on government. Number 2 for me is this issue about social licence, and social licence for on-land renewables, social licence for the extension of transmission social licence for offshore renewables, and I dare say at some point the question about social licence for nuclear. So I think that should be high on the agenda to get that clear. I also think that labour is a real issue, and skills. So making sure that we continue to invest in young people and skills, capabilities to expand the workforce, I think is important. And I think the fourth thing is that government will have to decide what the future looks like insofar as, do they want to go up against the IRA in the US, and if so, to what extent? And what does that look like if we want to attract international assets? And I say assets because, for instance, to build an offshore wind farm in Australia, we actually don't have the ships required to embed the towers in the sea floor. And so we've got to attract those sort of assets to the country. And you're not going to do that unless the commercial incentive is there to bring them here in the first place.
Thank you. I like your optimism. When have the governments ever been good at managing the future? Thank you very much.
What do they say? That necessity is the mother of invention. We can hope.
Tony Melville.
Tony Melville, Director of the National Press Club. So retail electricity prices are coming down, and back a few years ago you were seen as really cutting through, predicting what was going to happen in 2022 with electricity prices. Yes. How do you see electricity prices going now? Are they going to come down further? What are the risks in terms of electricity prices?
Yeah, look, so I think it was an AFR conference where I was a panellist, and I rang the bell and said, hey, look, I think, no one's talking about this, but from where we sit and all the modelling we're doing, and we understand the way the regulators view the default tariffs, that we were likely to see an increase in the sort of mid-40% range over the next little while. It wasn't quite, the outcome wasn't quite there, but I do note that off the back of that and further discussion, a government took steps to intervene in the market and apply caps to gas pricing and to coal used for generation, which did mute the degree of that increase. So we're pretty much on the money is what I would say. As I sit here today and I think about all the input factors that compose the bill, network charges are going to continue to go up. The capital base is going up and the cost of capital is going up, and that's 45% of the bill. But it won't be nearly as volatile as the increase that we've seen in wholesale charges that occurred almost overnight off the back of significant baseload losses, coal-fired power stations, lack of reliability, and the gas crisis that came through Europe through Russia and Ukraine. There will continue to be pressure on renewable energy charges as it becomes a bigger percentage of the bill. And we talked about the cost of replacing old generation with new generation, and whilst renewables are the cheapest form, they're not as cost effective as these retiring baseload coal-fired power plants. So there'll be pressure. Ultimately, there'll be savings through technology and things like that, but my view is there'll continue to be upward pressure on tariffs. There'll be some relief coming through in wholesale over the next year or two, but I think that'll be short-lived. You won't see the volatility in energy bills that we have seen in the past. That's the good news. But I don't expect bills to come down overall. I do expect them to trend upwards.
Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Jane. Tim Shaw from the Press Club. You're running a campaign at Alinta, True Power, and it's very much a customer-facing communication strategy. Many would say never seen it before from an energy company. But Anna Henderson from SBS asked a question regarding a recent CSIRO review that surveyed thousands of people and found that a majority of Australian consumers wanted a moderate pace of energy transition. Is that in line with the transition that is happening in reality? And what is your True Power communication strategy telling you already?
So firstly, a number of, I guess, proof points, if you like. The CSIRO study, and there's been some media about that this morning, and a view that consumers are saying, look, they're prepared to trade the pace of the transition to keep a cost on energy. The recent polling by Redbridge was that 2/3 of energy consumers are now putting energy price ahead of the environment. Now that wasn't the case as little as 2 years ago. There's been a significant shift there. And our own experience where people are contacting, we've got more customers on hardship on payment plans today than we've ever had. And we're spending more money around social obligations, bringing in things like energy audits, appliance replacement for people in dire hardship, so that they can get to a point where they can potentially pay their bill, people in energy poverty. And the calls that we take through the contact centre, which, millions a year, and the feedback we're getting is all consistent with what Redbridge have uncovered and what CSIRO are saying. So based on the sample size that we have, and we have, circa 1.1 million customers, there is now, I think, a huge shift in the community to say that we must continue to move towards net zero. But I think they are questioning, and I said earlier, what do we save by being a day late? What does it cost being a day earlier? And that's a conversation we should be having.
Thank you.
Andrew Probyn.
Call me Oliver. I'll come back for more. A few years ago, I forget who the Prime Minister was, I think it might have been Malcolm Turnbull, he was talking about how in the future we would have community batteries where various households would feed into this thing that sits on the corner. Is that happening? Are you investing in it, or has technology and ideas just moved on?
No, it's absolutely happening. So I note there's already been a couple of batteries that have been introduced, community batteries. The investors in those batteries to this point have been the distribution network companies, and they're using it to, at this stage, optimise the new build infrastructure in the local neighbourhood. So they're looking at it from an infrastructure investment cost point of view. The way that we're coming at it as a gentailer is we've built digital platforms now where we want to tap into that and make that a commodity product that will help bring down the cost of energy, not only by reducing distribution costs, but also by introducing more affordable energy across more hours of the day. So not just when we have that glut of solar in the middle of the day.
Thanks.
All right. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. It's such an important debate, and certainly one that the club is very keen to continue progressing. But if you could please join me in thanking Jeff Dimery for his time today.